In the last video, I touched on Engels' draft of a Communist Confession of Faith. It consists of 25 parts or articles, as it were, a list of axioms. This is mirrored in a way in Spinoza's method of axioms, which strangely Wittgenstein quite liked. There's a strange sort of shared feature in all three, and it's related to the belief that for a system or philosophy to be cogent and useful and valid, it must have axioms, and then they build on them, and you have your edifice of truth, which should ideally cover everything and justify the value put upon what's been written. This is very strange because there's another word for an axiomatic system, which is a closed system. Closed systems, in effect, are self-justifying, and if you attempt or question the axioms, then you're either going to face quite an angry person or an indifferent person, and your questions will be dismissed because you're questioning the validity of the entire system. If you move one supporting stone, in this case every axiom is a keystone, and the whole thing collapses. So I have got a list of stuff here to do with, in effect, the fatal flaws of woke and its predecessor, or where it sprang from, Marxism. This is often, such attempts are often dismissed as uneducated and really rather dull, heard it all before, that sort of thing, by convinced ideologues of both the wokeism and the Marxists. But I'm going to give it a whirl. Axiomatic thinking is quite dangerous in as far as it denies reason, the need or value of listening, and essentially denies the paradoxes of reason. Closed system thinking cannot tolerate contradiction or even disagreement. I mean, it's a contradictory element of disagreement, but it makes disagreement intolerable for them. In logic, if you accept contradiction, it implies anything goes. In other words, it's a recipe for chaos, and is therefore considered, contradiction is therefore considered intolerable, which is strange when you think about it, because if contradiction is considered to be so terrible, then according it meaning would be to accord it an element of truth, which is rather strange, because logic would tend to think that any contradiction must be false. That's quite important. And what we do is we temporarily suspend the law of non-contradiction to be able to use logic, to, as it were, break logic out of its closed system, so we can use it as a tool for understanding and for, in the scientific side, manipulating the elements of the world to create things which would otherwise be impossible. Pocket calculator, for instance, or a mobile phone. The chance of that actually existing without some creature with agency, such as a human being or human beings to make it, would be pretty well absolutely impossible, certainly vanishingly unlikely, even to the extent of the whole universe. That's quite something, because we are humans and we are very, very special. But that speciality, that extreme quality, doesn't appear in ideological thinking, in woke or Marxist thinking at all. it would be dismissed. But closed systems are like that because, by definition, they cannot engage with reality because they're closed. But strangely, human beings do engage with reality, which puts a coach and horses through Marxism and wokeism in one fell swoop. We have agency. The ability to do things, to be able to do things and get things to happen the way we want them to happen, demands freedom of thought and consciousness and the ability to satisfy the three paradoxes of reason. The first one, of course, is that based on the notion of emotion driving reason, because without that there would be no reason to reason, and consequently we wouldn't be thinking. So the paradox in there is that we have to tolerate or accept the importance of emotion while at the same time forbidding emotion to participate in the process of reasoning. The second paradox is also quite interesting in as far as that to be able to keep our minds from freezing on the sheer overload of information and sensory perception, most of the stuff we see and think about or hear about, the information and the sensory perception, is not tested by logic before it goes into our heads. Consequently, a vast amount of our memory and understanding is based on non-logic. It doesn't mean to say it's illogical, it just means that it hasn't been tested yet. Should we test it and look at our presumptions, we can then be free to dismiss certain things which we might have heard. I know, for instance, before I started trying to understand the world seriously in my teens and onwards, that I believed the most awful things about the disabled, about politics. I mean, at one point, in my total ignorance and lack of understanding, I made a suggestion to one of my uncles, well, Sainsbury's owned by the Jews, isn't it? What the hell? And another time, to my shame, I succumbed to the idea that possibly the severely disabled were too much of a drain on society. Yes, I'm not going any further. This is a danger of people stripped of philosophy. Now, ideologues are, in a way, very childlike because they don't think for themselves in matters of politics and morality. That's done by the algorithms of ideology, which get into their thinking processes, and they automatically spit out political and social opinions without intervention of the criticism of consciousness. That makes them extremely dangerous, because at the same time, of course, the process of thinking is necessary to be self-aware. I think, therefore I am, and all that sort of thing. Strictly, it's I think, hence I am, because there's a time difference there, a causal element, not a logical one, because we're more sophisticated. So these very people who are imprisoned by ideology, their minds imprisoned, to spit all this stuff out robotically, are ferociously defensive of a very thing that strips them of agency as ideology. So, closed system thinking, yeah, it's pretty bad news. The second thing is that Marxism and wokeism are quite deterministic in a very crude way. They really don't understand that, and won't accept in many cases, that we do have aspects of humanity which give us a freedom which determinists would deny. An example, for instance, is in language we have the ability, and in meaning, of something called metamorphosis of meaning. You can, if you put two ideas together, a third one can appear. But interestingly, in the process, the meaning of a third, although it is the product of the two ideas that preceded it, is not the logical sum of those ideas. This is critical. In the physical world, you get the same sort of metamorphosis and utility. In a very simple example, if I was to take a bunch of cloth, just sort of, like stringy stuff, and made out of strings and all sort of wrapped together, and then also take a stick. Now, the utility of the two separate things. One, you could just about, I don't know, you could sort of rub things on the table, but you couldn't do much with it. And the other thing, a stick, where you can beat people up with it, I don't know what, put it on the bonfire, but that's about it. If you stick the two together, you have a very useful floor cleaning device called a mop. And you can go on, this sort of metamorphosis utility is much more radical if you look like something with a motor car or a mobile phone. You can, if you were to reverse engineer them in a way, and right back to the raw materials, the fundamental raw materials and the energy required, you would have heaps of iron ore, you would have heaps of this, a little bit of magnesium, trace elements, a little bit of gold, all in little heaps. Now the utility of each one of those is utterly different from that of a mobile phone. And you can't add those utilities up. But when they're combined, the metamorphosis of utility creates something very different and magical. Years ago, I think I said before, in the East End, I saw a drug dealer leaning out of a window of a newly built council house. He was busily doing business on a mobile phone. He didn't understand in a million years what went up to make it, that piece of magic in his hands. I was a little better than him. I understand a little bit more, but not much really. We're both pretty ignorant. So this is a magical freedom we have. There's a freedom metamorphosis of invention, the physical world, of meaning, metamorphosis in emotion, where emotions can combine, like love and hatred, and create another one. I don't know what it is, it varies. People talk about a love-hate feeling and all this sort of thing. It can happen. Contradictory elements can remain unresolved and humans still go along. And the same with reasoning. If I reason, as I'm trying to do maybe with you now, I have to accept that if you were to come to me and say, well, I don't believe that, or that's a bit wrong and so on, I have to take that seriously. I don't just dismiss it because my logical axioms in my philosophy say, well, that's BS. Go away, I'm not listening to you anymore. And that's what ideologues do. They hear one thing wrong and they assume that the person spouting off has lost it. And however much else good they say, they don't listen. In Stalin's Russia, of course, they put you against the wall and shoot you because really you're just beyond the pale. You're beyond redemption. It's interesting, it's quite a religious way. Stalin used to sing hymns with his chums occasionally. Yeah, it's amazing he did that. And then he would happily execute a few days later. With great regret, but it was necessary because the ideology determined it. So he was doing the work of goodness by killing his friends. He was like that. He wasn't a complete raving maniac. He was a robotic psychopath, artificial psychopath. Like ideologues could be artificially stupid. So you have highly educated, highly intelligent people who are artificially stupid. I like to think I'm reasonably intelligent because of the artificial intelligence given to me by education, experience, and a little bit of awkwardness forces me to step out of line. It's not much good for being in society, I can tell you, but that's another problem. Anyway, utilitarianism is a problem with Marxism, and that's made very plain. Marx in places indicates quite clearly that rather unpleasant people using their envy and upset about the inequality of the world was useful for the revolution. What he fails to observe is that when people think about ends justifying the means poison the end. They're organically linked. It's not like a cause and effect deterministic process in a very primitive way, with one like that, No, it isn't. Cause and effect is vastly more sophisticated. You can have an endless line of causes going back through history to one effect now, and then you also have co-temporal causes, two effects. So there's 2 or 3 dimensions to causality. Then, of course, you get the other problems. When does a cause become an effect? You get reductio ad absurdum if you try and analyse that one. But as we have consciousness, we're capable, and we're willing to accept contradiction, we're capable of distinguishing between a cause and effect by looking at what's happened after and what's before, the change in the qualities, and so you can get an idea of what did what. It's like we can only do this because we lift time references off events. Otherwise, they'd be trapped in the historical progress and we couldn't do this. But we can. Our consciousness is caused by the process of lifting time references off thoughts to be able to think about and engage with the physical world of reality, as opposed to the intersubjective and the subjective, which have their own rules. They are different. The rules of existence differ between each one, which I've explained before. Another point about the weakness of Marxism and wokeism is that they persistently use in their theories as a foundation the horrors and ills of the past. That seems pretty odd, to somehow think that bad things can be the foundations of good things. I find that very odd. Yes, history teaches you lessons, there's no doubt about that. But by suggesting that the evils of the past are essential foundations rather than how we overcame them for what we should do today, is rather like saying, well, yeah, a lot of bad people in the past, maybe we should use them to make today's good things. It's weird. And the arguments, the Remain arguments, fatal ones in 2016, it's the reason why Remain lost the referendum, I think, was because they were using bad to try and justify good. And that's very, very, very odd. Next fatal flaw, it's amazing how many flaws there are in woke and Marxism, is utopianism. They're both, I think, expression is teleological. They're aiming at a target, an end point. Now, if you believe in a utopia, a fixed utopia, like Sir Thomas More's utopia of the 16th century, well, you know, shows you were a time traveller of that time, and you lived in the time of Thomas More, and this utopia might have seemed sort of sensible then, and then you time travelled to today. You wouldn't think it. You wouldn't be a believer in Thomas More's utopia anymore. Things have utterly changed. But ideology doesn't handle change well. And Marxism and wokeism, their utopia is fixed. And fixed utopia is fatal. Because when circumstances change, which they're doing all the time, all your great ideas for humanity, all wrapped up in this self-justifying utopian system, suddenly become inhuman because circumstances have changed. The point is, the demands of humanity are constant, but the means of satisfying the demands of humanity, so you could list technology, all sorts of things, you know, weather conditions, the ability to have a language, the ability to industrial invention and so on and so forth. All these things utterly change the shape of the utopia. The very best I can say about utopia is a dynamic utopia might be possible, where satisfying demands of humanity in the most efficient way, that includes the inessential demands, once the essential ones are satisfied, change. The way you do that changes depending upon circumstances. That means that the utopia is constantly changing in parallel with the present messy world we live in now. And politics should be focused on that constantly moving target to get as close as we can to it, instead of trying to force people, frog march them down a shining path to what must be the case, regardless of what's changed in the meantime and how the world has changed and technology's moved on and populations have expanded and so on and so forth. Marxism and woke don't do that. They're static. It's appalling. I mean, you look at the 20th century and the likes of Pol Pot, they're all trying to ram home a theory by a philosopher, Marx, invented in the middle of the 19th century. That alone was a flaw. And it's just unspeakable. You had instances, for instance, in Ukraine during the Holodomor, which was a deliberate mass killing by Stalin to feed Moscow whilst the Ukrainians starved. At the beginning, the idea was to wipe out the kulaks. Now, if you had a horse, that made you an oppressor, by definition. One horse, and your family, into cattle cars, over to the gulags. A lot of you will die, oh, what a pity. But it's all for the good of a utopia to come. So put a smile on your faces. Yeah, that is what ideology does to people. Another fatal flaw in Marxism wokeism, but I think maybe less in wokeism, because wokeism isn't quite as developed as this. It might be. Is piggybacking on Marxism. It's possibly there. The view of human nature is very odd. In the Marxist world, in the 19th century, 20th century, there were various goodies. Capitalists, obviously, and the bourgeois capital, terrible. And so they're essentially bad. And the victims are essentially good, the proletariat. So it was like a sort of Manichaean process. And in the Marxist view, they'll slug it out. Inevitably, the capitalists would self-destruct. And then people then would suddenly, because property would disappear, the cause of the capitalist nastiness would also evaporate. It's the same way in one of the clauses which I mentioned before in Communist Manifesto of Faith, around about 22 or 23, I think, that the belief that intermingling will somehow, in effect, make cultures and differences disappear, as if by magic. So the sort of human nature after this conflagration would be, in a way, tabula rasa, in a property-less world. And everyone would be very lovely, and each according to his need and whatever, each to their ability, each to their need. Wonderful, and we'd all love happy-clappy, and like we live in a Coca-Cola world, teaching the world to sing. It's odd how these sort of things slip across into capitalism and back again. So the question about human nature is very odd, and even today most people are very unsophisticated about this. They believe that there must be one human nature, and it's just a squabble about whether it's essentially bad or good or whatever. It isn't that. There are human natures, and aspects of human nature are come from birth. They're genetic, or product of genetic. They're not genetic themselves. Everyone knows that certain people are bullies. Anyone who's been to a boarding school would have seen quite young children beating a living daylight sometimes out of victims, so to speak. I was a victim. Well, unfortunately, at times I can be a bully, I know that, but certainly I wasn't at school, and quite seriously so. And many others suffered the same fate. And the bullies did that, as it were, pour encourager les autres. In other words, they keep their own little retinue in line by making a fairly frequent reminder for them by saying, well, this is what happens to you if you step out of line. And an awful lot of people live their lives like that because they know if they step out of line, unless they've got real muscle in one way or another, they're going to get it in the neck, and life's too short. And that's the way how bullies get away with it. But I saw this in very young children too. Now, that's rather odd, Because if you believe that children are born natural, does it mean that mother turned them into evil bullies by the age of 3 or 4? No. Some children are naturally bullies. They need to be handled in a different way. Not in a cruel way or hit them all the time way. That's nonsense. But the idea that there's one universal system that's good for everybody is a denial of human difference. It's the same attitude, really, that an ideologue would have. So you get the dreadful, dreadful shame in schools, boarding schools and day schools, where they're trying to apply one rule fit all. And what it comes down in many cases is that school systems are based on the idea of how to keep the bullies under control. And that same rule and behaviour on the part of the adults running the places is applied to all the children. And that can be very damaging for children who don't need to be supervised heavily and need a bit of freedom to develop their creativity and mental abilities. It's very difficult. I think teaching is an extraordinarily difficult thing. But trying to squeeze all the children through the same set of rules, same standard approaches, is in a way potentially abusive and can be dreadfully damaging. I know at my schools, many boys had a lovely time there and speak only good of them. Others, like me, well, it's something we don't always want to remember, but it haunts us, so much so that I'm gassing on about it now. So, those are some of the problems of Marxism. There are many others, but the essential thing is that it is fatally flawed, methodologically flawed, and its attitudes, particularly utilitarian one, the means justified by the end, has been shown in history to encourage the most abominable inhumanity on a scale that would be beyond Olympian. Millions sent to their death because the theory said that it was justified and right. Academics should be aware of their power and significance, or their influence and significance, but I think many would deny it. That's a pity, because there are very many academics, good ones, who need to be free from the threat of bullies, academic bullies, who force them towards denying democracy. This is a common complaint I make. If you go into a copyright library and look at a number of books, heavyweight books on democracy, you will find virtually nothing. You look at heavyweight books on Marxism, Engels, other ideologies, and various developments from it, feminist Marxism, whatever. You need a couple of large lorries or more to be able to cart them away. There's tons and tons of stuff. But the most important one about democracy and how it best creates social and political power, encourages the most cooperation, and is able to bridge the gap between physical reality and the intersubjective, there's nothing on it. Virtually nothing. I find that beyond astonishing. It is possibly the greatest shame of the 20th and 21st century. And you can be certain that the Marxists and the wokists will do nothing about that. And in the same way that Stalin and A.H. believed that social democracy was their first enemy to wipe out before they set on each other, so most of the humanities academics have come to believe that democracy is something that should be wiped clean off the board. It's quite sobering. So those fatal flaws which I talked about should be remembered. I'll list them again. It's a closed system. The belief in a sort of Victorian view of naive determinism is another one. Utilitarianism, where the means poison the end. The foundations being fractured. In other words, the idea you can build good on a foundation of bad. Utopianism, tramline thinking, which denial of circumstances and change, and human agency. There's no need for human agency if you already know what utopia is. You just got to whip people in line and make them do what's necessary to get to that wonderful place. And of course the confusion about human nature and human natures, denial of human natures. And there are as many human natures as there are human beings. It's obvious. There are some people who are suicidally brave and quite capable of dying for their fellows. Wars have proved this. And don't tell me that people went out and earned their VC because they wanted to feel grand and virtuous. Many VCs, the vast majority, are very shy and retiring people. They don't go around with a swagger and say, "Oh, how virtuous I am," which of course is a la mode for today's politicians. They're noble. Today, ignobility is considered noble. So human nature. There is no human nature. There are a myriad of human natures. And then in the in-between, the Marxist one, which is sort of strangely Manichaean, well, capitalists are sort of poisoned by property and making them evil, and proletarians are victims and essentially good. And they have a great big struggle, and property is destroyed, and everyone lives happily ever after. Oh, good grief. It's so primitive. You find it hard to believe that this is what is driving modern politics in this country. It's almost beyond belief that so many highly educated people, vastly more intelligent than me, should think that way. Is absolute proof in the reality of artificial stupidity on an Olympian scale. They had no excuse for it. They were also sucked into it. And once they find that their feeling of existence, consciousness, might be threatened if someone starts questioning the robotic system in their thinking that spits out preformed judgments relating to society and morality, once they get to that stage, it will take an awful lot to pull them back. Well, there you go. I'm quite pleased with that. It may be a bit incoherent for you. I might write it down and try and make it clearer. Because what I'm attacking is the Leviathan of stupidity. And I'm attacking the standpoint of people vastly more intelligent than me, vastly better educated, and yet just so stupid it's almost breathtaking.